Hello, this is Father Steve Mitten. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak with you about Laudate Si, biodiversity, and climate change. Today, as I prepared this talk, was May 24th, 2020, which starts the year of Laudate Si. It commemorates Pope Francis's encyclical on the care of our common home, which is our 5th anniversary of that document. And that document is one of 296 encyclicals, but it's the first one written not only for the Catholic bishops, but for all men and women of goodwill. So that's a pretty neat document. That document links social justice for the poor with ethical and mandated behavior towards the environment. And in short, the document describes what it means to be human. It's a call for ecological conversion, and it guards against self-centeredness and tries to attune our attention more to emphasizing the common good. In that document, all issues of social justice are interconnected, and the Pope calls for a new paradigm to address them, which he calls integral ecology. That paradigm he spells out in chapter 4 of that encyclical. We are all God's creation. We all share in that grace, and that if we would like to have a world in which we can give to our children, we have to be able to know what we're doing and stop doing what we're doing to make the world unsustainable. And the Pope invites us this year, the year of Laudate Si, which starts May 24th and ends May 24th in 2021. It's a document that calls attention to the cry of the earth and of the poor. We as Christians, and baptized Christians at that, is mission driven, and so we're guided by Catholic social teaching. And Laudate Si is the Church's full statement of Catholic social teaching to date. And it speaks about environmental sustainability, which we can define as the ability to practice and use the natural resources given to us in a sustained way to offer them and leave them behind for future generations. Which is what this little diagram you see here is: society, economy, and the environment. And sustainable development, sustainability, is the integration of a whole number of disciplines. And so human ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good, is spelled out in Laudate Si. Ecology, human health, law and policy, economics and businesses, social and culture, ethics, humanities, and justice, or all the context in which integrated ecology begins. And the Pope begins the document talking about the context, which is the great acceleration of climate changes or temperature of the earth warming up. And it begun with the fossil fuel-based capitalism, which has undermined and threatens the planet's real existence. And we're really hitting close to the ceiling in how much the earth can tolerate without causing catastrophic outcomes for humanity. So human systems like democracy, development, growth, and economics are completely dependent on the vitality of natural systems. And so everything that we do is lodged in ecology. So the Pope also talks about what do we see as we look at our current environment, and we see that climate change is taking place, and it's changing our health, and it's changing the air quality. And it really falls mostly on the poor. So if we were doing social justice for the poor, we also have to deal with the environment and pollution and climate change and burning of CO2 gases, carbon fuels. He also spells out that there's a direct link between climate change and air pollution, as well as our decreasing food supplies. But I would suggest there's other things that are going on if we look at the main 9 principles or boundaries of the planet. So the world got together back in 1988, established this United Nations Environmental Program that came out later with a document on climate change 2019. And it basically says we really have a 10-year window of being able to do something. or maybe possibly it's irretrievable. And so we just look at here in Chicago, we know that climate change has gradually changed and warmed up. What does that do for the climate? Well, remember, climates are long-term trends, and weather is a local phenomena. And so we can see that as the average winter temperature in Chicago has increased, there's still lots of variability. What's going to continue is that this variation and variability has probably become more extreme. So there'll be hotter summers and also more water in the spring, etc. And we've already had a taste of this, polar vortex where it becomes so incredibly cold. It's not new, it's just that the variation may be a little more extreme. I spoke a little bit about the 9 planetary boundaries. These are concepts put together by scientists to look at the sustainability of the planet, looking at the main principles. One of them is biosphere integrity, which includes biodiversity, the ecosystems, functionality. Climate change is one, atmosphere, biogeochemical flows, freshwater use, the amount of freshwater we have, land system changing, that means moving from natural states to more urban or agricultural changes. And so what you see is a beautiful picture there of reds, yellows, and greens. That blue center line that you have right here in the center of that picture is the functionality of the planet. And you can see that there's a lot of green there. That means it's a go. It's doing pretty well within that boundary. But as you move beyond that blue line, you're going to see a larger red line, and those are warnings. And so if you can see that 3 of these planetary boundaries are already in the red zone almost, that being biodiversity loss, biogeographical chemical flows, particularly of nitrogen and phosphorus, way beyond the red mark. And then you have climate change, which is becoming to be problematic. So these 3 of these 9 interlinked planetary boundaries have already been overstepped, that being biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, and global warming. The Forbes magazine in 2019 polled Generation Z, that's the age group of 18 to 25-year-olds, and they said climate change and environmental issues constitute the most important issues of the day for them. So global warming impacts human societies. So climate change, as we saw, is one of those 3 that we've really got very close to the boundaries. And what's the consequence of climate change? Well, number 1 is increased heat wave frequencies, which already is what most people die from, severe heat in the summertime. You can increase the risk of food and waterborne diseases. Think of an example of the increase in mosquito vector diseases like malaria. We also have water shortages, loss of glaciers. I take my students to Peru. There's lots of ice glaciers up in the Andes, at least there used to be. With climate change, that amount of snowfall at the top of the mountains are not as prevalent. And so Peru, Lima particularly, is going to have major water shortages in the future. They're very much concerned about that. And then, of course, we also have a predicted large decline in fish catch in the tropical oceans, particularly coral reefs, as these coral reefs begin to disappear due to increase in the acidification of the ocean. Acidification of the ocean is when you pump more CO2 in the atmosphere that dissolves in water, forming a carboxyl acid, which dissolves the calcium bicarbonate shells of these creatures, coral particularly. You're also going to have valuable species that we use for resources being able to be moved more further towards the poles, which I'll talk a little bit about it. One of the consequences, of course, of global climate change is climate refugees or climate migrants. And the World Bank in 2018 predicted that by the year 2050, 143 million migrants will be displaced. And you find it primarily due to ocean rise. A lot of these island nations are no longer existent, extreme weather events like drought and water scarcity. The second thing that the boundaries of the planet are being shaken is that of pollution, primarily pollution due to nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen is mostly in nitrogen gas. It's not used, but plants can be able to use it by incorporating fungi. And what we have done is that we have produced mass quantities of nitrogen primarily for agriculture, which ends up in our waterways and has these huge freshwater algae blooms. You can see it even along the ocean, right? And so what you see is that this is a map of agricultural United States, the breadbasket of United States, and the amount of nitrogen moving from the cities, but also mostly from the farms into the Gulf of Mexico, causing huge dead zones and death of fish and aquatic ecosystems. Phosphorus is another element that is usually locked up in rock. We mine about 20 million tons of this a year, and 10 million tons of it ends up in waterways, which causes increased eutrophication and death of aquatic ecosystems. And the third thing that we're looking at is the consequence of our action is the loss of biodiversity, which really is the loss of ecosystem function. So as just a reminder, life has been on the planet 4.1 billion years, and we are newcomers. We only are about 300,000 years old. And there's lots of evolutionary processes that work, which includes integressions. And so it's not a clear, quick line of evolutionary history. Lots of sharing of genes and transfer of genes across phylums and groups. I'll give you an example, lots of symbiotic relationships. Coral is a symbiotic relationship between two organisms, an animal and a cyanobacteria. So those are just examples of evolutionary history. But in nature, about 0.1 extinction per million species per year, but currently we are almost 1,000 times higher with that, 100 extinctions per million species per year, which is averages about 40,000 species a year or over 100 species a day, mostly in the tropics that are being lost due to human activities. So what do we mean by biodiversity and why is it important? Well, biodiversity is a number of things. One is that it's ecological. It's the diversity of ecosystems, the different habitats, niches, and species interactions that are taking place. It's also the types of species that are found in these habitats, the number of individual species. And then it also includes the genetic pool, the genetic diversity, which allows evolution to take place. And the World United Nations has called biodiversity the common heritage of all humanity. And so there was a treaty to preserve this biodiversity, which we haven't done very well with. So how much biodiversity is there? Well, for what we know that have been found by science and named is about 1.7 to 2 million species. But there's probably a lot more, not only probably, there is a lot more, estimated to about 100 million. And why do we value biodiversity? Well, there's direct use of it, primarily for consumption, use of plant for fibers and for pharmaceuticals. We use a lot of them for industry-based. We harvest timber, we harvest animals. But also the biodiversity is important with respect to ecosystem services, the types of processes and services that the environment provides us, which would cost us thousands of millions of dollars if we had to do it ourselves. To give an example is filtering water. Wetlands do that for us. If we got rid of all the wetlands, we'd have to do it ourselves. So the ecosystem services in the United States alone are estimated at about 300 billion per year. Incredible. We also can talk about the values of biodiversity with respect to recreation and the aesthetics. The beauty of the pristine woodlands, hiking, wildlife watching, etc. However, the document Latte C has also called our attention to the fact that biodiversity in and of itself has intrinsic values because it's alive and living. And if we even look at, even here in Chicago, many of the people say that we would like to continue maintaining biodiversity for future generations because they believe that nature is God's creation. And these are really important reasons for why we would like to preserve it. Lots of benefits, as I said before. There are threats to biodiversity. One of them is habitat loss. That's the main one. We're cutting these things down, the forest, the change in the environment, over-harvesting of fish and organisms, pollution primarily due to nitrogen and phosphorus pollution. Climate change does impact diversity, and then invasive species. Looking at climate change, we know that organisms that are not able to evolve and move as fast as the climate is changing. The last major extinction was 6 million years ago with the extinction of most of the dinosaurs and other life. We're seeing the effects of climate change on those organisms that live in the tropics and also live at higher altitude as well as higher elevations, like penguins in the South Pole and polar bears in the North Pole. Here in the United States alone, the Audubon Society is looking at climate change, predicts about 389 bird species, which constitute about 2/3 of the American birds are threatened with extinction by climate change. When they say extinction, that means extinction within the United States. Many of them may be moving into Canada, and we'll only find them there, etc. For example, this is just using an Audubon data analysis looking at endangered burrowing owl. The picture on the left is its current geographical range, and then on the right is what it predicts, and you can see the decline, the intensity of the yellow, which is the summer range where it breeds, is much reduced. This is a bird that you're familiar with, is the common goldfinch, American goldfinch. This is its current geographical distribution, and within the Audubon Society predicts that this is what it's going to look like when we increase carbon dioxide within 2050. So we're not going to have goldfinches here in Chicagoland in the summertime. That's a consequence of our human actions. Again, major reasons for biodiversity decline is habitat fragmentation, habitat clearing, loss of habitat. Agriculture constitutes about 19% of that loss. Overgrazing, 35%. Forestry, about 20%. Coastal development, which were good for wetland birds, shorebirds, coastal birds are in great decline. And then we don't often think about the impact that introduction of new species into an area does with native species. So the invasive species, #1 invasive species in the world, which has led to more extinctions of animals, is the cat, the domesticated cat. Here in the United States alone, feral cats and domesticated cats account for about 3 billion bird deaths a year. And then there's other human things like poisons and toxins and windows and stuff like that, windmills, which impact birds. This is just a slide that shows you the number of birds estimated per year, and those are the years in which they were estimated. So it's quite a bit. Glass, windows account about 1 billion birds a year. What does this biodiversity loss mean? Well, the consequence of biodiversity loss is that it really changes ecosystems. And these biodiversity changes affects the ecosystem function and services that they provide. They really disrupt ecosystems. I'll give you 2 examples with respect to insects and birds. We know that insects are decreasing greatly. When I was a young person in college, I drive from Zion, Illinois to Chicago. You had to stop along the way to wipe off the bugs off your windshield. You don't have that anymore. The bugs are gone. Bugs are good pollinators. Bees are great concern about bees, native bees particularly, because they are our pollinators. We will always have jobs in the future if we continue to do so, because we'll have to hire people with a little paintbrush to go around from flower to flower to pollinate the plants so we can have food. And secondly, seed dispersals. Animals and birds particularly are great means of getting seeds dispersed from one area to the next, and without them, you have extinction of many plants. So there's a great concern, and the Pope is quite aware of this, and so you are as well. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it, and God bless you all.